Hi everyone, I'm Flo, for those of you who haven't met me. Thanks for coming today. I think Maddie really appreciates you guys having turned up in person. So I'll be covering personality disorders and the Mental Health Act. Hopefully we won't go for too long so that lunch doesn't run too over time. So just some general fourth year things. I think it's really important to try and run your own race during fourth year. It's really easy to get caught up in the hype of everyone's stress. So just try and stick to what kind of your priorities are for the year. Secondly, try and look out for each other. It can be a really stressful year at times, and I think it's really helpful having everyone's support if you need it. And finally, I'm doing a BMed Sci this year, so if any of you have any questions about that, feel free to ask either at the end or during the lunch break. So we'll start off with the Mental Health Act. So I guess in terms of all the law content that you do this year, this is probably the one that gets examined the most. You'll definitely have some questions in your Psych EMQ paper that are to do with the legal issues surrounding the Mental Health Act. So there are 4 conditions that need to be met for every patient that you want to use the Mental Health Act for. So first of all, the patient has to have a mental illness. Secondly, this mental illness needs to be in a state that requires immediate treatment. So either their mental health is at risk of serious deterioration that we need to intervene before it gets really bad, or their mental illness is at a state that they might harm themselves or someone else, and so again we need to intervene before that occurs. Third condition is that immediate treatment will be provided if the patient is under a treatment order. So I'll go on to explain the process of what happens with the Mental Health Act later on, but basically the whole goal of it, end goal I guess, is to get the patient under a treatment order so you can provide them treatment without necessarily needing their consent if their psychiatric state means that they're not in a place where they are able to give consent. So if they fall under the treatment order, then immediate treatment will be provided. That's one of the conditions, because there's no point giving them a treatment order if they can't get the treatment. And then finally, there has to be no less restrictive means. So if the patient is even though if they have a mental illness, but their mental illness is at a state where they're still able to give informed consent and they're willing and able to consent to whatever treatment you're wanting to give them, then you don't need to go through the Mental Health Act because they're willing and able to consent themselves. So in terms of the process, generally either a mental health practitioner or a medical practitioner will examine the patient. This can be out in the community, so some of you when you do your psych rotation might be on the CAT team and you might kind of get in a car and they'll drive you around to all the houses and they might be examined at their home. Otherwise, they might be brought into the emergency department and might be examined in hospital. So mental health practitioners can include social workers that have specialisation in psychiatric patients, might include psychiatric nurses, and a medical practitioner can be like a psych-reg, doesn't have to be a consultant psychiatrist. This person that's examined them can then decide whether the patient needs to be placed on an assessment order. And what the assessment order allows for the patient is for them to be assessed by a psychiatrist within 24 hours. Following that, the psychiatrist can then decide whether the patient needs to be placed on a temporary treatment order. So a temporary treatment order can last for a maximum of 28 days. And essentially this allows them to be given treatment without necessarily needing to provide informed consent at every step of the way. Because they are under the Mental Health Act, the psychiatrist in charge is essentially making these decisions for them. This lasts a maximum of 28 days before the patient is then brought to a mental health tribunal. And the mental health tribunal will decide whether the patient will go on to be put on a treatment order. And this can either be a community treatment order or an inpatient treatment order. Community treatment orders, I guess, are the less restrictive of the two, and so their maximum time limit is 12 months, which is longer than the inpatient treatment order, which can only last a maximum of 6 months. So, with ECT, there are some exceptions. So ECT, has anyone explained to you what ECT is yet? Yep, cool. So ECT, essentially, because of it's kind of like a procedure, I guess, there are some separate conditions. So if the patient is under the Mental Health Act and they're not able to consent, they need an extra mental health tribunal to decide whether they can be given ECT. So even if they've already had that initial mental health tribunal to put them on the treatment order, they still need this extra mental health tribunal. Secondly, if the patient is able to consent and they're under the Mental Health Act, then we don't need to go through this extra mental health tribunal. And the third condition is that if the patient is a minor, so if the patient is under 18 years old, then we need to go through a mental health tribunal for ECT, regardless of whether they're willing and able to consent to ECT. So if you've got a 17-year-old who wants ECT, can understand the risks of ECT, can interpret the risks and convey their decision, they still have to go through this mental health tribunal. Okay, so that's, disorders. Okay, so that's the first part of this lecture. Yeah, sure. Yeah. Yeah. So I guess for kids, because they have to go through it. So sorry for the formatting, but I'll move on to talk about personality disorders now. So I guess in terms of what you might be examined on personality disorders, most of it will probably be in the EMQs, and then with the OSCE, I think probably the only personality disorder that you could expect as an OSCE station would probably be borderline personality disorder. So basically, I'll just outline each of the personality disorders in brief, with enough detail that hopefully you could answer an EMQ on it, and then I'll go into borderline in a bit more detail in case an OSCE comes up on it. So essentially with personality disorders, everyone has personality traits, but not everyone will have a personality disorder, even though they have those traits. So what kind of distinguishes the traits from the disorder is the pattern of, I guess, inner experience and behaviour. So someone with a personality disorder will kind of always have these personality traits, regardless of whatever situation they're in. They don't really modify their behaviour to kind of take into account who's around them and what type of situation they're in. And the most important thing is that their personality traits leading to the personality disorder is causing some form of distress or impairment that's clinically significant to the patient. So I guess as with all these psych conditions, they kind of have to have an impact on the patient's interaction with others, either social interaction, interaction in their workplace, interaction in their relationships, in order to be kind of clinically significant. And that's the same with personality disorders. So there are three clusters of personality disorders. We've got the first one, which is the schizophrenia cluster. The second is kind of the psychopathic cluster, and the third is the neurotic cluster. So I'll go into describe each of these. So the first one is the schizophrenia continuum. And just to keep in mind, schizophrenia as a condition, which will be talked about hopefully by Matt in the psychotic disorders lecture. Schizophrenia is not a personality disorder. It doesn't fit under this continuum, even though this continuum is called the schizophrenia continuum. So there's three in this continuum. The first one is schizoid personality disorder. So this is someone who tends to be quite detached. They kind of enjoy being lonely. So they enjoy not really having, lots of social relationships, and they don't really complain that they're lonely. They just are. The second one is schizotypal. So I kind of think of schizotypal as schizoid personality disorder plus what we call magical ideas. So magical ideas can be either delusions or hallucinations. So they might have a strong belief of like a fixed held belief of sorts on top of this seemingly enjoying this social isolation. And because of this, this can lead to quite a lot of discomfort if they have close relationships in their social network. And finally, there's paranoid personality disorder. So in terms of this is someone, I guess it's just as the word paranoid describes, someone who is not really willing to trust people. Their affect is often quite hypervigilant and guarded, and they're quite suspicious. So they might have some beliefs that, for instance, the FBI is monitoring them, or if you go and interview a patient with paranoid personality disorder, they might think you're a spy for the Russian government. Something along those lines is a pretty classic presentation of personality disorder, of paranoid personality disorder. And I guess just to comment on personality disorders in general, they're not usually, maybe aside from borderline, they're not usually the primary presenting complaint that will bring someone into hospital for psychiatric treatment. It's often actually a comorbidity that occurs alongside another psychiatric diagnosis such as depression or schizophrenia. So then we've got B, so the psychopathic continuum. So there's 4 here. The first one is antisocial personality disorder. So this is someone who doesn't really care about the rights of others, and they often get into trouble with the police. So these are characters these are people that will often end up in jail. They might lie a lot, steal a lot, and they're generally quite impulsive. The second condition here is narcissistic personality disorder. So this is someone who has quite an inflated sense of self-worth. And because of this, they're really hard to argue with because they always think they're right. And they might often have quite a fragile ego. And so it's actually trying to overcompensate for the fragility of their ego that they're putting on this act of being quite self-important, and they need this validation from other people. There's histrionic personality disorder. So for this one, I just think of someone who's like dramatic. So someone who might be seeking attention from other people. This is the classic kind of description of a patient in an EMQ would be someone who wears a lot of makeup, dresses really nicely for a consultation, but comes in and then says, "Oh, I'm so sorry, I'm such a mess this morning," but they're immaculately groomed. This is someone who would be classically someone who has histrionic personality disorder. And because of this, their affect is quite labile. So it'll they might be really happy. The masks, I think, depict that quite well. And then there's borderline personality disorder. So like I said, I'll go into this one in a bit more detail. You could definitely get this as an OSCE. It's a really important condition to know, and it's often a comorbidity of patients who also have other psychiatric conditions. So in terms of a bit of epi, it affects around 1% of the population, and it's more common in females. One of the key risk factors for borderline personality disorder is early childhood trauma. So many of the patients who do have borderline personality disorder have experienced some form of early childhood trauma, whether it be from a relative, from a neighbour, from anyone in their lives during that time. In terms of the clinical features, some people use this acronym or mnemonic, whatever this is, called impulsive. So essentially, I stands for impulsivity, M for moodiness, P for paranoia, U for unstable self-image, L for labile intense relationships, S for suicidal gestures, I for inappropriate anger, V for vulnerability to abandonment, and E for emptiness. So there's those 9 clinical features, and I think you need 5 of them in order to satisfy the first, the A criteria in the DSM-5. So generally the way they'll present quite often in the emergency department will be through the suicidal gestures. So that's one of the ways that borderline personality disorder could be kind of the key psychiatric condition that a patient has in hospital, is if they present kind of after an acute crisis following an attempt at ending their own life. The 2 kind of key features that I was told when I was on rotation are the moodiness and the emptiness. So most patients with borderline personality disorder will have at least one of those 2, if not both. And I guess the other ones kind of make sense in that if you're someone who's quite impulsive, quite moody, and quite vulnerable to abandonment, then you're quite likely to have intense relationships that don't really last too long and really fluctuate a lot between, being in a good state and being in one that's not so good. One of the features of patients with borderline personality disorder is what's called splitting. So does anyone here know what splitting is or wants to explain it to everyone? Okay, I'll just explain it. So essentially, splitting is when a patient with borderline personality disorder views everyone in the world as either good or bad, and there's no in between. So there's no kind of grey zone. And often this is thought of to stem from that early childhood trauma. So I guess the childhood view of the world is often one of good and bad. And so there's kind of these theories that essentially that early childhood trauma kind of has caused this patient to be stuck in that childhood mindset of the world being good and bad. And so they've kind of brought this forward to their adult lives where they'll view people as good and bad. So if you see some doctors interacting with patients with borderline personality disorder, and then afterwards they'll be like, oh, she really hates me now. And oh, she loves me. So they'll might send certain doctors to see the patients with borderline personality disorder because of this. And often it's because of this splitting phenomenon that can be seen in these patients. In terms of the management, DBT. So if you ever hear like DBT, it'll be to do with borderline personality disorder. And if you ever ask for management of borderline personality disorder, say DBT. So that stands for dialectical behavior therapy. It's essentially a specialized form of CBT, so of cognitive behavioral therapy. So therapy that encourages the patient to kind of think about how their thoughts influence their behaviors, influencing their actions, and influencing their psychiatric state. I don't really know in terms of the specifics how DBT varies from general CBT, but it does require regular commitment from the patient. So they do have to go, I think, maybe once every week or once every 2 weeks to see the psychiatrist for this therapy. Okay, so finally, the last continuum is the neurotic continuum. The first one under this category is avoidant personality disorder. So this is someone who has that hypersensitivity to rejection, and they don't want to assume responsibility for what they do, and they often have quite a low self-esteem, but they want friends. So even though they might also appear quite lonely, similar to that schizoid personality disorder, where both of these people with personality disorders might appear quite lonely, this person with avoidant personality disorder wants friends. The second one is obsessive compulsive. So this is exhibited by the traits of perfectionism, and this perfectionism kind of persists to a state where they're unable to grasp the overall picture of what they're doing, and so that actually impedes their ability to work well. They can be quite indecisive, and they can be quite devoted to their work. So I think it's really important to keep in mind how this differs from OCD, so obsessive compulsive disorder. So OCD isn't a personality disorder. This is a separate condition. With OCD, you have the obsessions that are kind of the thoughts that you are fixated on that then need to be addressed by the specific compulsions. So you do the compulsions in order to relieve your obsessions, and your compulsions specifically address those obsessions. Whereas with OCPD, or obsessive compulsive personality disorder, you don't really have that direct connection between the obsessions and the compulsions, and it's more just traits of perfectionism and indecisiveness. Finally, there's dependent personality disorder. So this is someone who always needs to be taken care of, and they can't really make their own decisions, and because of this, they might be quite submissive in relationships, and they kind of fear of losing any sorts of support. So often this patient might have had an illness as a child, and so they became really dependent on their parents for support and dependent on their parents to look after them, and this is again carried forward into their adult lives. So that's all I was going to talk about. If you have any questions, feel free to ask or at the end, but I think lunch should be here. Cool.